Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and all of our friends here. We come to our second day of the Black History Month programming. Today, we are blessed. I am so excited to present this talk by Dr. Sara King, The Biopsychosocial Impact of the Art and Neurobiology of Stress, an awareness-based approach to healing intergenerational trauma. I'd like to say that is a mouthful, but when you learn about Dr. King, you will see that, like, if there was anyone capable of even diving into a problem this challenging, it is her. So just a quick heads up what this whole programming is. This is some programming for the 2022 Black History Month. The theme is Black Health and Wellness. These are free, virtual public lectures and workshops centered on Black health and conceived by a diverse collection of healthcare workers, artists, community activists, and organizations. Our 6 days of programming can be found on the hosting website, theblackproject.org/blackhistory22. Special shout out to the Black Project, the Black Literacy and Arts Collaborative Project. They're this amazing group that provide resources to under-resourced communities of color in the literature and art space. They have mentorship programs, storytelling projects, a Spread the Love program where it's just about you telling someone out there that you appreciate them. They have book giveaways. Definitely a group worth your time. You can learn more about them at theblackproject.org. Now, a disclaimer, the views expressed by the speakers and workshop organizers do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the organizing groups. All of our programming uses the Zoom meeting or Zoom webinar format. You will notice in the webinars that the chat function is turned off. That's actually to prevent unexpected interruptions. However, we definitely want to hear from you. Questions for speakers can be submitted through the Q&A chat function. At the end, I'll read those questions out to Dr. King, and we'll have a conversation about that. Now, like I said before, Sara King, she is by far a Renaissance person, neuroscientist, teacher, medical anthropologist, social entrepreneur, public speaker. She's a yoga instructor. Her research focuses on the relationship between mindfulness, community and alternative medicine, and social justice, but it is so much more. She has created this framework, which she will talk about, which helps us understand how we can engage communities of color and underserved communities and better address their needs. She's currently an NIH post-doctoral fellow in neurology at Oregon Health Services or Health Science University. In the Oregon Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine in Neurological Disorders. She's presented at Google, she's presented at Stanford, she's presented at Berkeley, she's presented at the MoMA. She has an upcoming project at the Museum of Modern Art. We talk about, the next generation of healthcare leaders, and, we think about it as this thing that's far away, but this is who you're meeting today. This is the next generation of healthcare leaders, especially in this diversity space. So it is with my profound pleasure that we welcome Dr. King. And let me do this and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Dr. King. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was a really incredible welcome. And I already feel so much incredible belonging inside of this space. And so if you all would just give me a moment, I have to share my screen so that I can go into my presentation. And I am just so happy to be able to share a bit of my journey with you all. So yes, Daniel already introduced the rather lengthy title of my presentation today. But it is genuinely my hope that as I'm going through this presentation, that you will be able to experience it as something that is very different than what you may have encountered before, especially if you're used to coming to talks inside of an academic space. So I'm going to go full screen here. And I'm going to start out with an overview of my presentation. I would really love to offer up a very brief practice that is really merging the experience of mindfulness and art. It is meant to be deeply accessible to anyone and everyone. You need zero previous experience. All you need is a bit of willingness and curiosity to engage. After that, I will be giving a brief introduction about how the practice of mindfulness has been defined, both from the perspective of my own personal practice. I've been practicing both mindfulness meditation and yoga for 17 years now, as well as I will dive a little bit into the scientific literature in the attempt to demonstrate what has been spoken about in terms of this relationship between mindfulness and trauma. And just a little bit of a note there that one of the reasons why I find it so important to talk about trauma is because it is absolutely so undeniable the way in which collectively we have all been incredibly impacted by and are feeling into our own experiences of trauma throughout this pandemic. I will give a brief overview of the potential physiological benefits of mindfulness, and you'll see that I have a little bit of a quotation mark around potential because I actually want to, lovingly disrupt the way that that is spoken of, just trouble the waters a little bit and give a little bit of context around how the physiological benefits of mindfulness are actually potentially quite different depending on what kind of body you live in. I will then do a little bit of theorizing about how stress and chronic pain as experiences of the body are related to identity, as well as our trauma response as it arises from the function of our autonomic nervous system. And so at certain points in this presentation, you may see me bring up certain, charts that have a little bit of complexity to them, but I want to reassure you that I'm going to do my best to simplify as much as possible, and that the point is not that we're all developing some sort of exhaustive understanding of the material, but rather that we're learning and we are engaging with this material, I hope, in a way that makes sense to all of our lived experience of the now. I will then briefly define a little bit of what's been said about intergenerational trauma. What is that? How has it been approached within the scientific literature? I will give a brief literature review as well on the history of the clinical uses of art therapy, right? And why does art therapy matter inside of the medical space? As well as I will dive into a little bit of the neuroscience research on just explaining what is the impact for each of us when we either make or view art. Why is that important? And then I will shift from there into giving a brief overview of what I have developed in my research. It is called the Systems-Based Awareness Map. And this is a map of the relationship between individual and collective awareness and what those have to do with our experience of trauma and well-being. And I will dive a little bit into the launch of my program that will be happening in April of this year, called Art and Awareness as a catalyst for collective healing. It is going to be the very first awareness-based study and program to be launched in the museum's history. And then I will end with a very brief mindfulness and art practice and open things up for questions at that point. So wherever you are, I would like to invite you to do what you can to get comfortable in your space. Many of you are probably sitting down in this moment. Some of you may be standing up. Whatever it is that you are experiencing, I would like to invite you to begin to look at the screen in front of you with what I call a soft gaze. So you're not staring at the screen necessarily, but you're almost looking at it in a sense where you might get the feeling that you're kind of daydreaming. And wherever you are, whatever you're doing right now, if it feels compassionate, I'd also like to invite you to take 3 deep breaths. Maybe they're 3 of the deepest breaths you've had the opportunity to do today. And as you're taking those deep inhales and exhales, perhaps you might begin to feel your feet or whatever area of your body is meeting with the ground. Just sort of taking in the scene that is playing out in front of you, the cascading fog, as it is sort of rippling over the trees, and maybe you might pick up on the image of some beams of sun. And at the same time that you're just allowing this image to come into contact with your gaze, maybe you might notice that the shoulders begin to lower just a little bit. We might experiment here and feel into the difference between the left foot and the right foot and see if one is meeting a little bit lighter or heavier with the earth. And if you want to go a little bit even deeper into this practice, you can check in with the muscles of the belly. See if you've been holding the muscles of the belly tight towards the spine. And it may feel relaxing and comfortable to take one more deep breath here and allow the belly to be loose. Don't worry, nobody's watching. And we're just going to experiment here and see if you notice any difference in the way that you are holding your body, the way that you're carrying your body in this moment, as you are bearing witness to this incredibly peaceful scene in front of you. Noticing if there's any bit of relaxation that might have come into your awareness at this time. So that was just a brief practice of mindfulness that was being held inside of the container of art. And I'm going to move forward from this particular scene, but excuse the frogs in my throat. It's genuinely my hope that some of you were able to experience a moment of calm, a moment of shifting awareness, a moment of relaxation. Maybe you were able to connect a little bit in your own lived experience to what it is like to experience the power of slowing down. Slowing down, it is so, so important for our experience of overall health. And so here's where I'd like to talk about what I regard as many of the, not exhaustively, but many of the primary components of a practice of embodied awareness. That was what we were just engaging with, right? When we are bringing our, starting with our awareness, we brought our awareness to this relationship between what it was that we were seeing on the screen and what we were feeling inside of our bodies. Attention was the mechanism that we were applying in order to direct our awareness towards the screen, as well as towards our breath as it was moving through our body. We were able to alter our sense of concentration, right? You might have noticed my instruction to see if you could not necessarily stare at the screen, but guide a little bit more of your attention and concentration inside of the body while employing a soft gaze. Some of you may have felt the alignment of your spine or your posture shifting ever so slightly if you were tuning into the instructions to feel your feet on the ground, right? Sometimes this alignment of our posture is something that happens very naturally when we go into a place of slowing down. And as you looked at that video that was playing across your screen, perhaps it might have piqued some of your curiosity. Or maybe it was even the words that I was using, the language that I was using in order to instruct in that moment. But I want to take it even a little bit deeper and suggest that when we are in the practice of slowing down and employing just a brief moment of self-care, we can be engaged in the art of cultivating compassion. That is an act of compassion for ourselves. And the more we develop compassion for ourselves, is the greater compassion we can potentially give to others. But first, we have to notice, we have to recognize inside of ourselves the existence of feelings of stress, of moving too fast, of tension, of tightness, in order that we can actually tend to it with our awareness, with our attention, with our breath, right? When we're moving too quickly throughout life, right, it can have a really deep impact upon our ability to be present, to be in the present moment. We can begin to become kind of absent-minded, absent, not fully engaged in the spaces of conversation that we're having both with ourselves and one another. And so you can see that all of these various skills are really helping us to notice when we are shifting in and out of the felt state of presence or absence. And relationality and intentionality are so incredibly important, right? The way that we are relating to ourselves as well as others in our environment, the way that we are being intentional about taking time to slow down can really make all of the difference in our ability to recognize when it is that we are encountering feelings of trauma inside of ourselves. And we really need to be able to tend to that, right? And so from here, I want to shift a little bit into, because that was sort of a perspective that was coming from my own personal yoga and meditation practice. Here we have a little bit of quotes and evidence coming from the field that studies the science of mindfulness. And you'll notice a picture over on the left-hand side here of me standing with Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's widely considered to be one of the early progenitors or creators of the medical field, the clinical field that studied mindfulness within the United States. And Dr. Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as such. He says, mindfulness is commonly defined as the awareness that emerges by way of paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience moment by moment. And I love this definition for so many different reasons, right? Because it really encapsulates this power that we have to direct the energy of our awareness and the attentive capacity of our minds. What is happening? What is happening in the here and now? And we are still in this course of discovery within the field of the neuroscience and the psychology of mindfulness, of discovering, well, why is it that humans in this capacity to slow down and engage in the present moment? Well, why is that is so healing? And we have some ideas, which I'm going to explore with you later on, but really, this is a huge field of mystery. And one of the other things that I want to say is that that word non-judgmentally that you see in that definition, that is incredibly hard. I bet you if I could see everybody that was in the audience right now, if we were able to count the number of judgmental thoughts that we have about ourselves and others throughout the day, it would probably take into the hundreds. Who knows, maybe even 1,000 on a bad day, right? It's incredibly challenging. But one of the things that I have found is that when I notice that I am engaging in judgmental thoughts about myself and others, I use my mindfulness practice, I use my awareness and my intention, my attention in that moment to ask myself, what's my level of curiosity? Am I feeling curious about this moment? Am I feeling curious about the sensations and the feelings and emotions that are rising inside of me and in that person? Because when we shift from judgment into curiosity, we are no longer necessarily projecting our own cognitive understanding, what we think is going on in that situation. Rather, we are shifting from the thinking state into the feeling state, which is embodied, which can come much closer to an experience of authenticity. And so the author, David Treleaven, you'll see this definition at the bottom of the screen. I love his book, Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, Practices for Safe and Transformative Healing. He says, mindfulness, when practiced with discernment, can increase one's capacity to integrate trauma. And it does this by enhancing self-regulation, which is the ability to control our emotions, thoughts, and behavior. Right? So when we're having an experience of trauma, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this, what do we mean by having an experience of trauma, right? This is a deeply embodied experience. But essentially, when we're in a given moment of tension or tightness or contraction, when we're experiencing a microaggression, when we're experiencing not feeling safe, when some sort of harm has come our way, right? I think it's deeply relatable. We can all say that in those situations, we might have felt a little bit out of control in our experience of our emotions, our thoughts, and our behavior in that moment. maybe we came to a place of deep reactivity, right? You just kind of tend to go into like reactive mode, right? When you're experiencing a moment of trauma. And so mindfulness can give us the capacity to notice what is happening inside of our bodies and employ that healing pause, that capacity to slow down and connect with what we're feeling, such that it's not necessarily like flipping a switch, right? And that we're going to be able to automatically control our emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, right? But with the practice of mindfulness over time and employing a lot of the skills that I spoke about on the previous slide, we can catch ourselves before we go into that moment of reactivity and we say something super angry or defensive, or we say something that or do something that we regret, right? We're being in this practice of slowing down, just like we practiced at the start of this presentation. And that slowing down can give us the spaciousness to choose a different path. Choose a different path. Imagine what that could do, especially inside of our centers of medicine, where so much is happening in a big hurry, right? Everything is fast, 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 fast. And so many mistakes are made inside of that context that can actually be life-threatening. Imagine what would happen if more mindfulness was applied inside of that space, inside of the education space, the government space, the public policy space. Imagine the kind of healing that could potentially pour forth. So now I want to talk a little bit about the science of mindfulness, get a little bit deeper into this discussion of what has been said inside of the literature about the potential physiological benefits. And I'm just going to sort of read through these and then give a little bit of a caveat at the end. So we have a fair amount of literature that discusses the capacity of people engaging in mindfulness practices to increase their telomere length, right? And so we're talking about telomerase, which is the end caps of our chromosomes. And when the end caps of our chromosomes get shorter, that is a sign of increased aging. So this is a benefit that is actually expanding the healthy aging process. Mindfulness has been shown to have an anti-inflammatory nervous system response, meaning it is bringing down the kinds of inflammation inside of our nervous system that has been really deeply correlated to the manifestation of diseases such as cancer and various neuropathies, for instance. It decreases our cortisol production, cortisol being one of the stress hormones that is produced inside of the body, right? And so this is what we're talking about when we say that mindfulness has the capacity for potential stress reduction, the improvement of insomnia, right? So this benefit in terms of the quality of sleep that we're getting, the lowering and stabilizing of our blood pressure, giving increases in hippocampal volume. So the hippocampus is the area of the brain which is directly implicated in a lot of our functions for memory. So when we're talking about individuals who are suffering from mild cognitive decline or impediments, individuals who may be suffering from Alzheimer's or other neurodegenerative diseases, there is great interest in how mindfulness could potentially be beneficial therein. And then we have this lengthy phrase down here, the modulation of the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical response, which is just a mouthful of talking about one of the main structures of the brain that is responsible for our stress response, for modulating our stress response in the world. And so this is just another way of saying that mindfulness really can have the capacity to restructure the synaptic connections of the brain such that we can have greater resilience in our experience of stress. And we all know that stress is just a part of life, right? And so because stress is a part of life, there's deep interest in this question of how can we become more adaptive towards stress, right? How can we develop nervous system responses such that the stress that we are experiencing doesn't turn into chronic stress, which can truly become debilitating. But one of the things that I want to say in order to kind of trouble the waters right here is that the vast majority of these studies rely on self-report, right? And so when they're relying on self-report, that can introduce a little bit of what is called selection bias, where a lot of the times, many times when people are reporting on the impact of a particular intervention, it's mindfulness in this case, sometimes they're saying what they think the interventionist wants to hear. there's a lot of a lack of generalizability of these studies because there's a lot of different methodologies that are employed to study people who are undergoing mindfulness interventions. And so that's just another lengthy way of saying that we really need to be able to develop the capacity to have coherence between all of these different studies, right? So that we can have clarity on understanding what are the various neurobiological and neurochemical mechanisms that are responsible for many of these incredible impacts and effects that we're seeing. But then beyond that, there's a real issue of social justice that is happening within the field that studies the science of mindfulness, because the vast majority of the persons who participate in these studies tend to be from populations who are white identified, highly educated, and or college students or women, oftentimes between the ages of 50 and 65, right? And so when we are attempting to extrapolate from this data, from these particular populations and say, yes, this mindfulness intervention is appropriate for this group of Black or Latinx or Indigenous or other groups of people of color from marginalized and disenfranchised backgrounds, right? We're not necessarily able to just take the leap from that one set of data into these other populations, because as we know, depending on your identity background, you are going to be having a very different experience of being inside of your body. And that is important. This is where it is important to note that lived experience, culture, ethnicity are incredibly important data points to consider when we are talking about the function of mindfulness or the structure or function of the brain in any capacity. So what are the primary motivators that bring people to want to begin a mindfulness practice? I would say in my experience of teaching and practicing mindfulness as well as yoga, it's the experience of both stress and chronic pain, right? And who could argue with how ubiquitous the experience of both stress and chronic pain are, especially nowadays as we're moving through this point of the pandemic. I want to bring up this chart right here, and I know that there is a lot of information on it, but please try your best to not want to take in everything at one time. I just want to talk about what is the trauma response. And I want to zoom us into the red section of this chart, which was adapted by a wonderful woman named Ruby Jo Walker. This is not a chart that I created myself, but many of us have probably heard of the autonomic nervous system response of fight, flight, freeze, or faint, right? So if you zoom into the very center of this chart, where you see the red area, and it is representative of the deactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, there being two different branches of the autonomic nervous system. We have the parasympathetic and we have the sympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system has two different branches, right? But right now we're going to talk about the sympathetic when you're going into fight or flight, right? This deactivation of the sympathetic. And I want to ask you a question. How many of you over the course of your lifetime, or perhaps within the past couple of years, have engaged in a conversation or a situation where identity was really part of the primary experience? You were talking about race, you were talking about gender, you were talking about religion, you were talking about culture in some sort of a diverse space. And how many of you felt the emotions of rage, anger, irritation, or frustration rising in your body in that moment? How many of you felt the sensation of panic, fear, anxiety, worry, or concern when engaging in a conversation either with yourself or someone else about race, culture, gender, right? This is just to demonstrate that when we are doing this work of equity, when we are doing this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, when we are having the difficult conversations that have to do with identity, just as an example, we can be having the experience of the trauma response of the nervous system coming online. I've had so many people say to me, Dr. King, I've been trying to do this work of engaging in conversations around unconscious bias or, other sorts of conversations within the DEI space. And I tend to go into, when you go to the top part of the chart in the blue area where it says freeze, I've been feeling depressed. I've been feeling helpless. I've been feeling numbness. I've been feeling a sense of shame or hopelessness. What I want to give an understanding to is that in so many of our conversations that we're having right now in the DEI space, especially about race and gender and culture, right? And the wide differences and diversity of experiences that we're having. Many of us are actually experiencing the activation of our trauma response inside of our bodies, and we don't know that that is what is happening. We don't know that that is what is kind of undergirding the tone of the conversations, the nature of the conversations that we're having. I actually think that we really need to be bringing mindfulness practices into the space of these kinds of conversations. Because when we bring mindfulness practices in, and here I'm going to direct you to the bottom area of the chart, the green area of the chart where it says social engagement, because this is a map of the social engagement capacity of our nervous system. Mindfulness practices have been shown to activate the ventral vagal branch of the parasympathetic nervous system such that we can feel into mindfulness. We can feel into sensations of curiosity and openness. We can feel safe. We can feel connected. We can feel oriented in our environment. We can have a sense of being joyful and in the present and grounded inside of these conversations. And so what I want to say is that I think that there's a really real need to understand what the relationship is between mindfulness practices and other somatic practices that are engaging our awareness, and how those practices can be absolutely essential to doing the work of healing as well as social justice within the spaces that we work in. So I'm going to go over this slide really quickly, and I want to draw you, this is a slide that is talking about allostatic load. And allostatic load is the wear and tear, you see at the very top hand part of this chart, it's the wear and tear cost of maintaining a functioning system in response to stress, right? We all maybe have been familiar with this word homeostasis, and homeostasis is the process by which our bodily systems are able to maintain harmony and balance, right? And then if you go to the tan part of this chart where you see where it says environmental stressors from the work, home, or the neighborhood, major life events, or the experience of trauma and abuse. All of these are situations that they are contexts that are going to be really increasing our allostatic load, right? Now, why is this important, especially when we're talking about identity or when we're talking about the work of DEI or even social justice? If you go to the center of the chart where you see the brain and it says the words perceived stress right there, and I'm talking about how so many of us, in how we are experiencing the nature of injustice in this moment, in this country, as well as abroad, right? Whether that has to do with climate injustice or racial injustice or whatever, what have you. Many of us go into this feeling, which is natural. This is being derived from the evolutionary function of our autonomic nervous system. Many of us experience feelings of threat, helplessness, and vigilance, right? Now, if you go to the left-hand side of the chart where it says individual differences, this is talking about the ways that according to the genes that we have inherited, the way that the developmental experiences that we have had through our childhood and all of our lived experiences are going to make a real difference. Lived experiences, according to our identity, will make a big difference in how we are perceiving the level of stress within our lives, how we are responding to environmental stressors, major life events, or to trauma and abuse, right? And all of these are going to factor into, on the right-hand side of the chart, our behavioral responses. How are we going into fight or flight in any given moment, right? It's going to reflect on our personal behavior, on our habits of diet, smoking, drinking, or exercise, right? And so we can really see that it is very important to understand this role of perception when we're talking about perceived stress perception and awareness have a huge role in terms of what our capacity is to respond to all of these major contextual situations that we're talking about, and to be able to adapt, to be able to thrive, and to be able to return to our experience of homeostasis. So now I want to talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma. We've talked about trauma. We've talked about the trauma response in the autonomic nervous system. We talked about a little theorizing about what role the autonomic nervous system and the trauma response may have as we're engaging in the work of healing and social justice. And now I want to give an intergenerational perspective, because trauma is not just existing in this body from this time alone. And you'll see this quote that says, intergenerational trauma has interestingly been studied most extensively in the literature of psychology, which surveys Aboriginal or Indigenous populations around the world who have suffered from the effects of the violence of colonization. These studies have identified intergenerational trauma as stemming from the collective experiences of trauma, right? We have individual experiences of trauma, and then we have collective experiences of trauma. The collective memories of centuries of chronic stress and the resultant biological shifts in stress hormones in the body, such as cortisol, which have been passed down from generation to generation, literally altering the biochemistry of the womb and gene expression, and leading to the manifestation of psychological pathologies such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, and substance abuse. Now, I want to slow down for a moment, because this quote could not be more important. What we are talking about, right, is if we can take ourselves back to, for instance, maybe 1619 and the inception of slavery in this country, or if we want to take it back even further and we want to talk about the colonization and genocide of indigenous populations, right? Let's take it back by 5 centuries. We are talking about 5 centuries of human beings, women and their wombs. Imagine the alteration of the stress hormones, of the cortisol. Imagine what has been passed down from womb to womb to womb until now. And so I want to give this perspective, because when I look at the opioid crisis that is happening and unfolding across the nation right now, when I look at the rates of substance abuse, when I look at the rates of depression and anxiety and skyrocketing suicidal ideation, which we are seeing inside of our hospital centers, particularly in the degradation of the mental health of our youth in this moment in time, what I think is possibly missing is a lens on how these trauma responses are not just arising from the pandemic in the here and now. They are arising from centuries of living in a certain cultural context where there has not been, up until now, the proper resources for everyone from every single place in society to be able to have equitable access to what they need in order to hold that trauma, in order to heal that trauma, to talk about it, to destigmatize it, and to make sure that everyone has the resources that they need. Well, how are we going to do this? How are we going to fundamentally redistribute the resources that are needed to affect this level of healing and change? This is where I'm going to get into a very brief literature review on art therapy in clinical settings, right? And a lot of this research actually pertains very deeply to non-clinical settings, and I'm going to get into that as well. But I want to start with the clinical setting, because our clinical centers of research and healthcare could really benefit from a huge influx in support for art therapy, primarily because of many of the benefits that I'm going to discuss in this moment. And this has to do with how we are redistributing equitable access to healing across all levels of society, right? So I want to go over to the left-hand side of this page, and on the left-hand side of this page, you're going to see many of the benefits, right, that have been studied in clinical randomized control studies, right? As rigorous as you can get, we are finding that art therapy contributes to the reduction of pain for cancer patients, cancer symptom control. That it contributes to the reduction of the experience of depression and anxiety. That it is really being studied in this field of looking at early and advanced rheumatoid arthritis, looking at patients who are dealing with chronic pain for a number of different reasons, patients who are dealing with schizophrenia, patients who are dealing with PTSD and complex trauma. And what are we seeing in many of the results of these studies? Let's go to the right-hand side of the page, right? And this is just a small sample of the different types of symptomatologies, excuse me, that have been studied with regard to the effect of art therapy. We're seeing increases in positive mood, decreases in physical and existential pain, right? Especially for those patients who are facing a prognosis where they do not have a long time to live. We're seeing increased feelings of acceptance, increased adaptation, right? That capacity to adapt, which is so necessary for our ability to come back into homeostasis, as I just described. We're seeing increased resilience. We're seeing adjustments to feelings of limitation, loss, stigma, and isolation. We're seeing increases in the capacity to make meaning out of the experience of coping with these diseases. And we're seeing drastic reductions in hyperarousal, which is another way of saying that people are learning this ability for self-regulation, the modulation of our internal trauma response, the modulation of our stress response, such that we can feel a sense of calm, a sense of wholeness, right? A sense of healing returning to our lives. All of these coming from studies in art therapy. So I have this question that I began to ask myself, because I may have mentioned that I started out in my PhD work and then in a lot of my post-doctoral work, really looking at examining the nature of the neuroscience of mindfulness and the potential physiological and psychological health benefits that mindfulness can have. But then I started asking myself this question, because I'm a lover of art. I love going to museums, but also I have this practice of the past couple of decades where I love to take pictures of street art, graffiti. There's something so calming about being in the presence of graffiti and street art and knowing that the practice of graffiti and street art has really deep ties to the manner in which marginalized Black and Brown communities sought to beautify their neighborhoods, sought to bring healing in their neighborhoods when they had been stripped of so many of the resources that they needed in order to do this, right? But I asked myself, what about viewing abstract or figurative art might be a potential pathway to mindfulness itself? There are many people for whom a mindfulness practice is not necessarily appropriate, right? I don't want to give this impression like mindfulness is some sort of a panacea, because for many people who are experiencing trauma, mindfulness is actually not necessarily the best initial doorway into a practice of stress reduction and healing. And so I want to ground us in one of my favorite books. It's called Science, Order, and Creativity by one of my favorite physicists, David Bohm, as well as F. David Peat. And they say, any discussion of awareness must bring in the question of attention, which is closely related. Indeed, the two words are to some extent interchangeable, insofar as awareness can mean heedfulness, which also signifies attentiveness. Nevertheless, there is an important difference of connotation between these two words. And here's the crux of it. Thus, the word attention means literally stretching the mind towards something. This implies an inner activity that is needed to grasp the object of interest. Now, I thought to myself, that's incredibly interesting right there, to think that something that is so ephemeral, which we don't even have an agreed upon definition for, the mind, right? But this sense that the mind, which is so ephemeral, has the capacity to be agentive and stretch in the direction of something, that to me implies relationship, relationality, and agency of the mind, right? And then we can go a little bit deeper from this book by one of my favorite neuroscientists, Dr. Eric Kandel, from the book Reductionism in Art and Brain Science. And he says, the reason we can usually resolve the ambiguity of a retinal image accurately, right, the image that is coming through the eye, through the retina, is because our brain supplies context. Context. This context consists of other bits of information, those that are also present in the retinal image, those such as facial processing that are inherent in the computational machinery of the brain, and then finally those, this is another crux here, those that are learned from prior experience with the world, including the world of art. So this is to say that the way that our brain is engaging in sense making around abstract or figurative art, which oftentimes, we can't even really make out what exactly is in that image that we're looking at. We just know that we feel something when we're looking at abstract art. There's something moving inside of our bodies when we're looking at it, when we're taking in the color and the form and the structure and the quality of the brushstrokes, right? Now, why is it that we are feeling something in that moment? Because it is engaging with that which we have learned from our lived experience of all that we have brought with us from our prior experience of being in the world. And that's to say that all that you need to be moved or potentially healed by a work of art is the fact that you exist. And you exist, therefore you have awareness, therefore you have attention, and you have the capacity to stretch the mind towards this art, right? And really get something from it. I love this quote from the book Aesthetics in Neuroscience, right? And Maureen Burnett says that one hypothesis is that our experience of art is embodied. Through our spatial motor system, our body will truly interact with artworks. Information does not come to us. We have to actively look for it, right? You got to go there. You got to go and find that art and bring the objects of interest at the center of our retina. The phenomenological experience of looking for information in real life is entirely different from the experience of being still and receiving information. And so this is to say that when we are in the presence of art, we are not just passive recipients of that experience. We are embodying the experience of the art. We are reaching out agentively, relationally towards that art. And when art makes us feel something, our spatial motor system is processing it such that it is a whole body experience. And that is part of the reason why I think that art has an incredible capacity to engage in the very same neurobiological systems that are coming online when we are engaged in the practice of mindfulness. Now that's incredible when we think back to many of those physiological benefits that we saw that have been studied within the realm of the science of mindfulness, and then we saw many of the physiological and psychological benefits that have been studied within the realm and the domain of art therapy. We can see that there is a really deep relationship that could be arising between these two domains, art and mindfulness, in terms of their capacity to offer healing of trauma, and I dare say, healing of intergenerational trauma, because the trauma responses that we have in our bodies are not just belonging to ourselves, they are being passed down in part from generations of our ancestors. So here's where I want to talk about my research partnership with the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I know that we are getting close to the end of our time today, and I want to leave time for questions, but it feels very important that I talk about this for a moment here. So my project is being done through the Artful Practices for Wellbeing initiative that was created by Jackie Armstrong. She is an anthropologist and the head of research at the Museum of Modern Art. If you look down at the left-hand corner of the screen at this fabulous, gorgeous, trailblazing human being, this is the artist Betty Sara. She is one of the most world-famous African-American artists who is still living today. I believe that she is currently 93. I was initially invited to come and join the Artful Practices for Wellbeing initiative when Jackie gave me a call on the phone and she said, Dr. King, we are wondering if you would like to pick one work of art from the Museum of Modern Art's collection and record a meditation that is at the nexus of an exploration of what this work of art is about, as well as it is an introduction to your research. So I chose the work of art by Betty Sara that is right in the middle of the screen. It is called Black Girl's Window. And if you go to the upper right-hand corner of the screen, you will see the little placard that was in the museum. Down on the bottom, you can see me like posing next to Betty Sara's work of art when I actually went to the museum in order to listen to my recording myself. It was such an incredible moment to see that my research on the science of social justice, my research that is really looking at this relationship between mindfulness and art and social justice, was actually placed inside of the museum for people to be able to have an embodied experience of both the research within the context of this brilliant work of art. And so afterwards, my next collaboration with the Museum of Modern Art was called the Art and Science of Hope and Justice. I did this event with one of my dear and close friends and mentors, Dr. Dan Siegel, and my dear and close friend and colleague, Orlando Villarraga. This event was sponsored by the World Health Organization and the United Nations for their 50th anniversary celebration. And it was a direct extension of the collaboration that I did with the work of art by Betty Sara. We essentially picked out 6 different works of art from the museum's collection. And Orlando Villarraga is an incredible composer, and we created an event where we were really, instead of calling it mindfulness, we were directing people in their energy, in their attention, in their awareness to take in and be in relationship with each work of art with an ambient soundscape that was created specially for this event by Orlando. And then Dr. Dan Siegel and myself would kind of interject and give a little bit of contextual information about, well, answering this question, what is the neurobiology of hope and what does that have to do with justice? And then we would open it up to the audience to kind of comment on how they were experiencing this relationship between the art and the music and the science. And we were absolutely floored at how many people, there were thousands of people from all over the world that showed up to this event. And they would go into the Zoom room, into the chat, and they would say, I never thought that I would ever be into meditation. I'm not even really that interested in art. I've never experienced anything like this before. But there was this outpouring of memories that came forth. People were tuning into memories and sensations and experiences and emotions that they had never had in their entire life. And the experience, the feedback that we got was that a lot of incredible spontaneous healing arose at this deliberate nexus between the art and the music and the science. And so with that, I'm going to present to you, I know this is a very complex figure, but this is the Systems-Based Awareness Map that I will be launching at the Museum of Modern Art in April. Please do not try to take in the entire figure because it is a very complex scientific figure, I understand, but this is my theoretical map and model of the relationship between individual and collective awareness and how that is potentially impacted by the healing of trauma or by violence and the unintegration of trauma, right? And so in the experience that I'll be giving at the Museum of Modern Art in April, we will go on a systematic exploration of every single one of these layers, right? We will go on an exploration of what it means to connect with our sense of pure awareness, right? Or the quantum space that is filled with the potential of all possibilities. How do we connect with a sense of our internal awareness, or our memories, emotions, feelings, sensations, and thoughts? What does it mean to have a connection to our identity awareness, which I have coined as this rather lengthy acronym, the intergenerational epigenetics of intersectionality, because our experience of our identity is always that. It is always intergenerational. It is always about our epigenetics, and it is always fundamentally intersectional. What does it mean to be in the experience of being aware of the physiological dimension of our being, or our sense of vitality or disease, and on, right? And we will be using works of art, once again, from the Museum of Modern Art's collection that have been selected specifically to take us in an exploration of each layer of the map. And there will be a specially composed musical soundscape to take us on this journey in terms of exploring what the balance between sound and silence and art and science, what do all of these have to do with our capacity to potentially engage in a site of collective healing, in an experience of collective healing? And so with that, I'm going to slow down for just a moment. And I know that we're coming close to the end of our time here, but this is an example of one of the kinds of works of art that you might encounter inside of the space, that we might have the opportunity to experience with music, and to understand how this relates to our capacity to be aware. I genuinely hope that as many of you as possible will come to this experience at the Museum of Modern Art. I thank you so incredibly much for coming to my presentation, and I'm going to stop my share now because I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and I would like to take at least one question. Thank you so much. Oh, I can't hear you, Daniel.
As I was saying, amazing. Thank you so much. This is incredible work. It's interesting. It's dynamic. It's fresh. Well, I guess when we say it's fresh, the question is, right, these things have been around for as long as human existence has been around, but to be able to actually put a scientific rigor to it is quite incredible. I'm just making sure that we're both on the screen at the same time, which it looks like we're not. So I'm going to pin you and pin me. There we go.
I just wanted to mention that for those people who do have the opportunity to take part of the programming at the Museum of Modern Art, that there will be an option to participate in a study at the end of that program. And that is actually what is going to contribute to the neuroscientific research within this field.
Oh, interesting. And what will that entail?
It'll be a survey that they can take at the very end. And then those who wish will be able to engage in follow-up interviews. And then the corpus of all of this data, after it has been analyzed, I will be using to apply for research funds in order to do some fMRI work, potentially on
exciting. Wow. I was going to say, we have the Martino Center for Biomedical Imaging here at Mass General Brigham, which you should check out. So we're going to get to the questions now. I should tell everyone who is watching not to worry if you have to run, because these sessions are recorded and all of the recording will be put on YouTube later. So if you miss something, don't worry about it. But to start it off, a bit of praise, amazing session. Can you comment on the ways in which colonialism continues to inflict intergenerational trauma? Additionally, can you comment on the ways in which decolonization and liberation can help heal intergenerational trauma?
Ooh.
I know, right? Start off with an easy one.
Well, I do have some brief comments that I can say. One thing is that I am going to be publishing a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Contemplative Inquiry that goes into a really deep investigation and analysis of precisely the questions that you're asking right now. That will be coming out in April. And so I'll be sure to send that out for further reading. But just in this moment, I have to say that one of the most vicious impacts of colonialization, in my thinking, is the continued presence and spread and violence of white nationalism and white supremacy culture inside of our nation. And, you know, whenever I come into spaces and I talk about white nationalism or white supremacy, I know that that isn't a favorite topic. It's not a comfortable topic. It's a very painful topic. But when we look at what happened in the January 6th riots, right? And this is just my personal opinion, right? But when you actually look at the data from the various justice and law and public policy centers that are tracking the rise of white nationalism, you can see that there is a strain of thought and ideology and behavior that has existed from the inception of this nation that places many white bodies and their lives and their privileges over and above everyone who is not white. And there are beings who are willing to violently hold that system in place. We can even see that, you know, in the situation that occurred in Portland, Oregon, just a couple of days ago, with the person who came out and literally shot protesters who were protesting the young brother that was killed in Minneapolis, the young African-American man, by the SWAT team. And he was completely innocent, you know, so we can see how these systems of structural oppression, systemic oppression, are still being maintained and upheld. And I'm not saying this to say in any capacity that all white-bodied people are maintaining this structure, right? But we have to pay attention to the fact that there are still white-bodied individuals who believe in white nationalism, who believe in white supremacy, who are enacting it, organizing about it, and it's here in the United States and it's abroad. So that's something we have to pay attention to. And when it comes to this idea of liberation, liberation must be co-liberation. We can't leave anyone out. I don't care what your race is, your ethnicity is, what your background is. As we are moving towards liberation, it has to be felt, it has to be lived, it has to be somatic, and it has to be shared by everyone of every station. And I believe that the path to liberation has everything to do with how we approach the healing of intergenerational trauma for us all, period.
Interesting. So then, I guess on that same token, the whitewashing, or I'd say the way in which we tell history to students, right, where we ignore voices of color, LGBT voices,
yes,
non-binary voices, and we have this narrative which a lot of people can't necessarily see themselves in. The success of progress probably has a lasting effect on intergenerational trauma as well.
Absolutely. You have to be able to see, to be mirrored, to see yourself reflected, acknowledged. That's one of the primary ways in which we're able to develop a sense of self-esteem and awareness of our power and our place and our positionality, our capacity to create change. We have to know that we exist. We have always existed, and that we have existed as equals throughout all of time. And so when you have a manner of storytelling that privileges one population and their stories and their narratives over everyone else's, it has the impact of invisibilization, which is in itself a maintenance of colonization, which is in itself a maintenance of intergenerational trauma. And so when I look at many of these laws that are being passed that are saying, oh, we can't talk about slavery in the classroom, we can't talk about anything that's going to make any group of people feel uncomfortable, I want to say that there is a certain amount of discomfort that we have to develop resilience around so that we can be honest with ourselves. It's not about making one group of people feel ashamed and guilty and terrible about themselves. Those feelings may arise, But at the end of the day, what is important is that we are telling the truth, we are being honest, we are elevating the stories of those who have been made invisible. And that is the only way that we are going to come together and do the work of being able to create beloved community.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have beloved community if you're not telling the truth.
It's interesting. It's actually a great plug for our Friday keynote from historian Hassan Jeffries. Hassan Jeffries, out of the Ohio State University, is a historian who specializes in what he has coined hard history, which is discussing these challenging issues of, slavery, of the people who have lost their voice, and how we need to be able to sit with that. So it seems like there's a lot of parallels here. Next question. This is mind-blowing. Congratulations. You blew some people's minds. I love the complete immersion experience of art, music, and mindfulness. It is safe to say, as shown, that one is changed neurobiologically speaking from this experience. Thank you. So congratulations. Then we have, when is the exhibition? Is it online? Is it available for online to experience? Can people do it virtually, etc.?
Yes. So one of the, I suppose, silver linings of COVID is that I'm not allowed to do this program in person. So it's going to be virtual. It is going to be on April 21st between 10, I believe it's going to be between 10 a.m., 10:30 a.m. and 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So as soon, I'm waiting for them to get it up on the MoMA website and on the social media and everything. And as soon as I have that invitation, I will send it out to you all so that you can sign up and participate.
So this actually brings up a very, very interesting point. Seeing as the barriers to enter, right, the ability to participate is so slim, and it's already going to be created anyways. Have you thought about partnering with, the NAACP or NOAA, which is this big art and health organization, or Facebook, some way to just kind of like spread the news and maximize participation? Because you have the opportunity of, instead of looking at, say, 200 participants, having the ability to scan through 200,000 participants.
I am open. I am completely open. Number one, I'm hoping that this is the first of many events. Number two, I'm hoping to be able to develop partnerships with a great many of different like museum spaces, various art spaces, just anywhere that I can plug into in order to leverage this capacity to get the art and the music and the healing experiences to the people. I'm completely open. Yeah. So if anybody has any ideas and you want to reach out to me, I can't. This work can't be done alone. It has to be done in partnership.
Lovely. Love it. We're here for you. We'll do whatever we can to help. Can you share the information for this study? Oh, like maybe someone wants to help with analysis.
Oh, oh, wow. Well, I did not think of that. And that would absolutely be useful. And I would say maybe I can share my email with everyone afterwards, including there can be like an announcement about when the event at the Museum of Modern Art in New York will be, and it'll have my email there. And please reach out, because I'm obviously going to need help with data analysis at some point.
And Dr. King also has a website where you can contact her, learn more about her. Bio is there. She does a number of different events like this, and she's available for consulting opportunities as well. And then let's send out that study and the MoMA event. So it looks like people are engaged.
Okay. Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Mind Heart Collective. I also send out announcements about the talks that I'm giving and various engagements, or you can find me at mindheartconsulting.com.
And this full recording will be available on YouTube. We'll also have links to her website where you can also find ways to contact her. We won't put her email there because who knows what kind of people troll YouTube looking for emails. But again, Sarah, Dr. King, this has been an amazing opportunity. Thank you so much. I look at this as the opportunity to start a collaboration. We really hope to see more of you here at, let's say, in Boston.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is absolutely my hope. And it's also my hope to do a lot more collaboration with Harvard Medical School and just lots of spaces around Boston. So totally open. And thank you so very much. It has been an absolute honor to spend my time here today.
Great. Thank you all so much. And we continue with our series later today. All right.